Hello and welcome to History Cross Tech. I'm Tech Elf, and on this channel I explore fascinating history topics and look at some of their modern connections that might surprise you. Today, I want to talk about something I find super fascinating, and that is the walls of Constantinople. I know it sounds a little bit niche, but there's a really interesting story here about how people solved problems over 1,500 years ago and how we can apply those principles today. So the spoiler is, if you want to know, these walls were incredibly impressive. They led to Constantinople standing for a really long time while other medieval cities got conquered, and it was because the walls had a defensive three-layer system, which meant that when the attacking army finally conquered the first wall, they saw an even bigger wall behind that, and an even bigger wall behind that as well. And this is best illustrated in a story I'm going to go into, which is the 717 AD siege of Constantinople, where an Arab army came and tried through a very long winter to conquer Constantinople, but we'll see what happened. So let's jump in. I'll give you some context. So Constantinople was founded in 330 AD by Constantine the Great as the new capital of the Roman Empire. Now today, Constantinople is somewhere near Istanbul in Turkey. But at the time, it was the new capital of the Roman Empire, and it sat at this incredibly strategic location where Europe meets Asia. Essentially, it was the final stop on the Silk Road, where all these major trade routes came together. And that made it extremely valuable, and therefore constantly under attack. I mean, if you wanted some cinnamon or some nutmeg and exotic wares, where else would you get it but behind the walls of Constantinople? It was definitely a city worth looting. But what's remarkable is how long it lasted. And we're going to explore why that happened. So, just to give you some more context, most medieval cities, they had a very short lifespan before being conquered. Paris, multiple times it was sacked in the Middle Ages. We all know the fall of Rome. It's referenced constantly. And London also was conquered repeatedly by Vikings, Normans, and other groups that came up, with their weapons and their ambitions to take over London. But Constantinople did not suffer the same fate. It stood unchallenged from 330 until 1453 AD. That's over 1,100 years of continuous operation as a functioning capital city that was under near constant threat. If you think about that for a moment, that's actually longer than most countries have existed, and it's longer than the entire history of many cities. Now, that wasn't just luck or geography, although the location certainly helped. The real difference was in how the Byzantines thought about defense and architecture. So they built these walls, and they called them the Theodosian walls. They built them in the year 400, about 100 years after the city of Constantinople came about. And those walls, with their continuous upgrades and maintenance, they protected the city for over a millennium. And how did they do this? And this is my favorite part, which I wanted to tell you all about. It was their three-layered system. And it's also the potentially reason why so many other fortified cities failed. It wasn't just that Constantinople was trying to defend itself. It was that they anticipated that they would fail. And then they anticipated and made a plan for what they would do once they failed. And I think other cities could have really applied this strategy as well. So while most medieval cities built defensive walls, they built one impressive wall, tall and thick with gates and towers, very straightforward thinking. We make the wall strong enough that attackers can't get through it, and we stay safe. But as I mentioned, Constantinople's engineers took a completely different approach. Instead of just one massive wall, they built 3 separate defensive layers, each designed to have different types of attacks and operate independently. The first layer was the outer moat. It wasn't just a ditch filled with water. It was carefully engineered to slow down attacking forces and funnel them into specific areas. This gave defenders time to respond and kind of forced the attackers into these zones where they could be targeted by the defenders. behind the moat was the big outer wall. It stretched across the narrowest part of the Constantinople peninsula, and it had about 96 towers spaced across its length. And this is what made it interesting. Each of the towers operated independently as an independent unit and had its own garrison, its own supplies, and its own command structure. What this meant in practice was that if attackers managed to capture one section of the wall, which certainly happened from time to time, the neighboring towers could seal off that compromised section and continue fighting. The entire system didn't collapse just because one part of it had failed. And then finally, behind everything else, there was this massive inner wall, and it was the ultimate backup system. When the big outer wall failed and the army finally got through it, thinking that they'd conquered the city, can you imagine the look in their eyes when they see another giant wall standing in front of them? I mean, talk about a demotivator right there. And yeah, this wall was designed, the second wall was designed to function even if both outer layers had been completely compromised. It was a third layer with its own supply systems, its own escape routes and command structure, and each of these layers was also designed for different threats. You know, the moat stopped cavalry charges and huge armies. The outer wall defended against siege engines and sustained bombardment, and then the inner wall was built to withstand, I guess, threats that they hadn't even thought of yet, and kind of just be an extra layer that would wear down people that were attacking. And I think, as I mentioned, the interesting thing about this design is the philosophy of it. You know, the Byzantines, they were trying to build a defense that would keep working after the attackers had gotten through and won the first layer. And it's a shift in thinking that many medieval cities hadn't thought of at that time. They, in a sense, they assumed that they would be breached and accepted that their primary defenses would eventually be compromised, and they had that backup. The question wasn't, will our first defense fail? Can we build a wall that's big enough and strong enough? It was actually, can our system contain the damage and continue operating when it does? How do we build in that redundancy? And I think that's pretty cool because, yeah, if other medieval cities did that, maybe they'd be standing too. So this brings me to one of my favorite stories about medieval battles, and that is one that's surprisingly rather unknown. It's the 717 AD siege of Constantinople. So Constantinople faced numerous sieges throughout history, but there was one in particular that really demonstrates, you know, the spectacular nature of this wall. So there was, in 717 AD, a massive Arab army. It was led by this guy, Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik. I'm not sure if I pronounced his name right, so please correct me if I didn't. But he was incredible. He had this army of around 80, I think it was between 80,000 to 120,000 troops. He had about 1,800 ships, and extraordinarily, he had a winning streak for about 20 years, conquering cities all through the Middle East. And they had gone on to Damascus, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Antioch. They'd all fallen using these methods of, you know, show up with overwhelming force, get through the wall with siege engines until they breached it, and coordinate this massive attack and occupy the city, then move on to the next city. Really, I guess there was no reason for them to think Constantinople would be any different. But interestingly, when this army breached sections of the outer wall of Constantinople, which they actually did successfully and repeatedly, the Byzantine defenders simply fell back to the inner wall and continued fighting. And this was a situation that this Arab army had just not encountered before. They came in expecting to win, expecting to loot the city and have a quick conquest and move on to the next one. And also, you know, Constantinople was the gateway to Europe. So they were expecting to move quickly from Constantinople to the next city and work their way through Europe. But they'd encountered this situation that they never really faced before. They were controlling empty ruins while facing even stronger wall and defensive position behind it. Every section they captured had to be garrisoned to prevent Byzantine counterattacks. They were running out of supply, fought all through the winter, which was very difficult for them, By the time winter came, they were in serious trouble. They were starving, and contemporary sources describe the soldiers eating their pack animals and then eating tree bark, and then worse, which I won't even go into, but disease spread through their camps. The Byzantine naval forces harassed their supply ships and didn't let them access them, and what should have been just one concentrated attack, it really didn't happen that way, especially because there were, those different sections of the wall. So the larger their army was, the worse their coordination became, kind of fragmented into dozens of separate mini sieges, each one requiring resources and coordination. And then, it spread on through the winter. It actually spread and dragged on for 13 months. By the spring of the year 718 AD, most of this Arab army was dead from disease, starvation, or Byzantine counterattacks, which was remarkable because they had had a 20-year winning streak all through the Middle East. The survivors in the year 718, the people that survived, they retreated with massive casualties. And did you know that the Arab expansion into Europe essentially ended there? Otherwise, they would have expanded into much of Europe as well. And I think what's significant about this isn't just that Constantinople survived because of this system with their walls. It's how, over time, their layered defense system degraded the capabilities of their attackers. And the longer the siege went on, the weaker the Arab army became. And the defenders, they were fine. They maintained their core functionality. They still had their resources. And you might be wondering why I'm telling you all of this in such detail, because apart from it being a really interesting historical story, the problems that the Byzantines were solving, how to build a system that continues operating under attack, how to contain failures so they don't cascade, how to balance the cost of comprehensive defense against the risk of total loss, these problems haven't actually changed. Yes, the technology has changed completely. We're not building stone walls. We're not trying to defend ourselves from armies on horseback and with trumpets and drums anymore. But if you look at how modern infrastructure is designed, if you look at cloud computing platforms and cybersecurity, you see essentially pretty similar principles at work. And just one quick example, which is kind of similar, is how Amazon Web Services, they have what you call availability zones. Each zone also operates independently with its own power, networking, and cooling. And if one zone fails completely, applications automatically move to other zones, and it allows that availability, which essentially is a similar concept to those defenders falling back from the outer walls to the inner walls. And Netflix also does something kind of comparable of note to mention, which is they use something called chaos engineering, where they deliberately break parts of their own systems in production to ensure that everything else keeps working if one part breaks. And I think this is remarkably similar to how Constantinople's walls were continuously tested by real sieges, with each attack also revealing weaknesses that could be strengthened. Although this, we're not in the year 717 AD, but some of these principles are timeless, and I think that's what makes this a cool story. Spoiler, however. Eventually, Constantinople's walls did fall in the year 1543. And this was to Ottoman forces that were armed with cannons. And this was a new technology. It represented a fundamental shift that the existing defensive strategies just became obsolete. But, and this is the interesting thing, even then with the cannon, with that new technology, the siege took 55 days and required coordinated attacks on multiple fronts. So, for a system designed in 412 AD to last over 1,000 years, and 1,000 years later in the year 1453, when a whole new technology of the cannon is used to take it down, and that's what's required to overcome these walls, that's pretty impressive. So that's the story of the walls of Constantinople. I hope that you will find a similar appreciation for them that I have, and I hope you stay tuned for the next episode where we talk about other cool history topics and their modern applications. The walls we have right now are mostly all digital, but the problems that the Byzantines were solving haven't really changed in 1,500 years if you think about it. Thank you for watching. I'm Tech Elf. Bye.